here in the United States, the argument is clear and sharp. And it goes like this. The United States, when you compare it with other OECD countries, more or less industrially developed countries, the United States spends much, much more as a share of its GDP on healthcare than other countries. We spend roughly 18 to 19% of the total GDP goes to four industries: doctors, hospitals, drug and medical device makers, and medical insurance companies. These four industries have produced in the United States a classic economic monopoly, very old, nothing new. We call it now the medical industrial complex because it's the parallel of the military industrial complex, which we have talked about in this country for 50 years. But this medical industrial complex delivers mediocre care. For example, Americans do not live as long as most people in Europe. American babies die in the first year of their life more than in most of the other OECD countries. We go to the hospital more often. We stay in the hospital longer. We are subject to all kinds of general diseases that do not afflict other people the same way. So we pay more than anybody else, and we don't get better than anybody else. We don't even get as good as everybody else. So the argument is a private capitalist monopoly system is a failure in delivering quality health care at an affordable price. That's the basic argument. Any system other than a private enterprise monopoly system would be better. So, for example, minimum reform, the kind of reform advocated by moderate Republicans and Democrats, is basically a set of ideas to weaken the monopoly, to force those four industries to be less cooperative with one another at the expense of everybody else, and by demonopolizing, lower at least the price. That's a minimum demand. A stronger demand is to say, let's have the government come in and replace one or another member of the monopoly. There you get the idea, for example, that the United States should do as other countries do, buy medicine from the drug companies wholesale, be the only buyer, get a much better price, and then resell the medicines to the public at a lower price, and that would screw the drug companies out of their big profits. But it would be, these are what I would call reformist efforts. And so too would be single payer, because really what that's about, and the American discussion is to do pretty much what they do in Canada, which is close to us, and they've had this for years, is to put the government into a kind of in-between situation between the individual and any of those four industries, so that the government basically is a middleman and thereby can force down the price of what is done. For me, none of these plans goes to the core of the matter. And the way I criticize them, and of course we support the reforms because they're better than what exists, and they're also a way to criticize the private enterprise of medical care, which is very important for us to do in terms of education. But put that aside, the problem for me is you don't, in any of these reforms, finally change the system, so that if you get any of these things, you can also lose it. That is, with the next election vote, with the next effort of the medical companies, who are among the most profitable companies in the American capitalist economy. They have enormous resources to use. That's how they got the monopoly, and that's how they will regain the monopoly, even if we do some of these reforms. So for me, I would much rather see the democratization of all those enterprises. To put the hospital in every area, the doctors in every area, in a relationship where they are a cooperative who is interdependent with the cooperative of the residential towns and cities that they serve. And so that the decision making is never done only by the enterprise. It has to include veto power for the customer, for the who gets served by it. That's the revolution inside the enterprises that govern, and that goes way beyond the insertion of the government as a controller, regulator, or intermediary. I can do that, but before I do it, let me agree with you. I think this is a mistake, an ideological and analytical mistake of the left, which happens sometimes. We're not immune to making mistakes any more than anybody else is. It's a mistake because it misunderstands the concept of work. When you have technical change, it doesn't just mean X jobs disappear and Y jobs come. It also changes the very meaning of the word work. This is a Hegelian and a Marxian understanding of the constant overdetermined transformation of everything. And if you forget that, then you make analytical mistakes. Let me give you a few examples. Every major technical change, the steam engine, the loom, the Iron Age, the electricity, the atomic energy, modern chemistry, every single one of these technical breakthroughs was advocated and celebrated by people who explained that it would get rid of drudgery. It would get rid of long, horrible hours doing repetitive tasks. Number one. Number two, every one of those technical changes failed to deliver on this job, on this promise. What do I mean? Today in America, young people are working more hours than they ever did before, doing very boring, drudgery, repetitive work most of the time. So something doesn't work here. The jobs are there. They are lousy jobs, but the jobs are there. They were lousy jobs before of a different kind, and they're lousy now in a different kind. But it misunderstands the role of capitalism as a system. And that's very, very important, because in capitalism, you always have this basic choice. Imagine with me a technical breakthrough that allows 50 workers with this new machine to do what it used to take 100 workers to do. Okay, now what happens? We only need 50 people to make all those shoes, or all those hamburgers, or all those shirts, or all those software programs. One option is to say to everybody working, you are going to get the same pay, you're going to work half the time, not 8 hours a day, 4 hours a day. But now you'll produce the same number of whatever. We will price them at the same price. Therefore, they will generate the same income, the same profits, because we're paying you the same wages. That would be a way of using the technical change to increase leisure. The beneficiary of the change would be the worker, whose workday had fallen by 50% because the productivity rose by 50%. The alternative, the capitalist fires 50% of the workers. He keeps the other 50% working. They produce the same as before, they charge the same price as before, they earn the same profit as before. But of course, the profit will now be enhanced by the fact that the capitalist, who gets the same revenue from the same number of outputs, doesn't have to pay half his labor cost compared to what he had before because he fired 50 of the 100 workers. Capitalism always chooses the second because that's what they're in there for, profit. You can't understand the effect of technology if you don't take into account the class structure which decides how to distribute the benefits of a technical breakthrough. We could have had a much shorter work week for everybody in the United States. We don't, but that's not the fault of technology. That's not some inherent concept of work. That has to do with how capitalism makes money from the technology. And because they're in charge, they decide to use technology in that way. In a democratic society, you would never do that, because if the word democratic society means anything, it would mean there is a democratic decision how to utilize a technical change. You say thank you to the persons who made the technical change. You give them a little reward. You give them some social recognition. But you leave to democratic decision what you do. Do you want more leisure? Do you want more output? Those are questions that are open, can be decided in any one of 1,000 different ways of balancing these things. And for me, that is the direction, that is the lesson to teach people. And why is this important? Because part of the transformation would be to say to the 50 people to the 100 people who work half time, if we want to use leisure. If the word leisure is troubling, don't use it. Say that in the other 4 hours that those workers don't have to work anymore because they can produce the same in half the time that they did before, they will now be asked as a part of giving back to society to use 2, let's say, of those 4 hours each day to provide programs for children, to provide programs for the elderly, to deal with the ecological crisis in our society. In other words, there's all kinds of work these people can be asked to do that takes advantage of the technical change in a way that isn't profit building, but society building. And that would allow people to say, yes, you're continuing to do work, less than before, but of a fundamentally different kind, governed by different criteria and different social goals.